Hey everyone, in this video we're getting into our literary terms and the elements and terminology that we need to know to be able to discuss and analyze literature, and the place that we start with that is with plot. So what is plot? Many literary terms or words are things that you've probably heard before or have a conception of already. So you've probably heard the term plot used as just a general term for what happens in a particular story. The basic events that occur in a narrative, though, are more accurately described as action. So it's not just, this happens, then that happens, and that happens at the end. It's more involved than that in literature. It's way more than just what occurs on the page. Our text defines plot as the way the author sequences and paces events so as to shape our response and interpretation. But a translation of that, to put it a little bit more simply, is that plot is not only what happens, but how the writer tells us what happens, what order they put the events in, what happens in flashback, what did they leave out, what is the form that they're using. All of these sorts of more intricate details are the things that we're really concerned with in literary plot. The major thing that all plots have to have, though, is conflict. Every story has some type of conflict, which is a struggle between opposing forces of some kind that needs some sort of resolution. There has to be a problem. If there's not a problem, then there's not a story. So plot hinges on conflict in many ways. A story's primary conflict is often more complicated than just two characters physically opposing each other, right? It's not always, this A versus B. A lot of times conflict is more layered than that. It's more internalized. It's more discrete. So it's something that we really pay close attention to when we're looking at plot. There are four conventional conflicts that kind of encompass the vast majority of plot conflicts that you'll encounter in literature. There's character versus character, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's when the struggle or the problem is between one character and another. There's character versus nature, which is when the problem is between a character and a natural force. That doesn't necessarily have to be, that can be a lot of things. It could be the natural world in terms of like weather or something like that. It could be natural health. It could be something supernatural, but it's something sort of part of the natural sphere that is conflicting with the character. And then there's character versus society, which is it's one character versus sort of these societal ideas or these societal standards. That encompasses a lot of conflict that you'll find in plot, and these three are what we would categorize as external conflicts. They occur between a character and something outside of themselves. It's them versus something else. Now, the fourth type of conventional conflict is character versus self. This is when a character is struggling with something within themselves. Maybe it's two things that they want, two duties that they have, two versions of themselves, and that's what we call an internal conflict. This occurs within a character, and these are often more challenging to sort of navigate through, but they're oftentimes more interesting, and a lot of times the more complex and comprehensive way to look at conflict. Another thing to be aware of in terms of plot is order and sequence. So in any story, the author is going to make choices in how to present the story's time unfolding. And it's not always in the order that the events occur. In fact, a lot of times it's not. Some stories occur chronologically, but authors frequently make use of plot techniques to manipulate linear time for an effect. So something that we need to be very aware of as we get started with literary analysis is that writers don't do anything for no reason. Everything about a story, you have to assume that there's a purpose behind it. There's a reason they did it that way. There's a reason that they ordered it that way. And there are a couple of techniques that writers can use to do that. The first is a flashback, which you might be familiar with. It's to show some action in the past or to provide plot information not occurring in the present. And that's a manipulation of time, right? If we were going in chronological order, the past comes before the present, but sometimes writers flash back to the past while staying in the present, and that's a choice to think about. There's also foreshadowing, which is when they're hinting at something that happens in the future. So if you think about stories that you've encountered, books, film, whatever it may be, sometimes there's a twist. We don't see the ending coming, right? But other times there are hints given to us throughout the story that sort of do give us an idea of what's going to come. That's essentially what foreshadowing is. And then the other term that I want you to know is in media res. It's a technique which is Latin, which means in the middle of things. This is when a writer begins the story in the middle of an action. So to use a film analogy, let's say the opening scene of a film is the middle of a car chase. That would be an example of in media res, because they're beginning in the middle of the action, right? There's no sort of setup or no sort of background information. We're just beginning right in the thick of things. That's what in media res is. Now, generally speaking, there are 5 parts of plot, and there are a lot of different iterations of this chart, but they all kind of look like this. This is the original Freytag's pyramid, but in general, they all kind of look like this little hill. And as the sort of line moves up, tension rises, and as it falls, so does the tension. And I'm going to talk about each of these stages of plot in more detail. So the first stage is exposition, and like I say, there's a lot of iterations, and you see in this iteration, they actually refer to exposition as setup. That's what exposition is. It's typically the opening, and it's the part of story that establishes the characters, the setting, and the situation. So going back to in media res, if it starts in the middle of the action, well, we're going to lose some exposition, right? But for stories that give us some sort of, this is who everybody is, this is the background information, this is all of the sort of setup of the characters and things like that, that's the exposition where we're exposed to the story. The second part of a plot is typically what we call the rising action, and that's sort of when the curve starts to tick up. This happens once the conflict becomes a relevant force in the story's pace or action. The action starts to rise. Another way of thinking about it is this is just when stuff starts happening. Typically the exposition, not a whole lot is going on. When things start happening and we start moving towards a climax, that's what we call rising action. It typically begins with a moment that shakes up the plot. So exposition is usually pretty stable. There's not a whole lot of, conflict or crisis going on. And then something is introduced that shakes things up. It destabilizes the situation. That moment is what's called the inciting event, or the destabilizing event, where things kick off. An analogy that people sometimes use to discuss the shape of a plot is a roller coaster, right? So if you think about if you're pulling out of, the station on a roller coaster train, most often there's going to be a few moments of sort of gentle level movement that's not all that exciting, that's just kind of getting you to the hills that are going to happen. And then as you start to crank up the hill, then that's when excitement starts to build. And then that's where, things start to get interesting. That's effectively what rising action is. Now, within rising action, the action typically continues to rise, so it gets more and more exciting the closer you get to the top of the hill. And this is due to complications, which are just new things that are introduced as conflict or that complicate existing forms of conflict. And then the top of the hill is the climax. A story's climax or turning point is the moment of greatest emotional intensity. This is where the conflict reaches a peak. This is the apex of the story. Now, sometimes this is external and overt. The bad guy finds the villain and they battle. But a lot of times, especially in literature, this is something a little bit more understated. This could be something like an epiphany, which is a revelation by a seemingly unimportant event, or a moment when a character changes in a sort of implicit way. That could be a climax as well. And that's the moment on the roller coaster, what's the scariest part? Well, right as you're looking over, right? That's effectively what a climax is. Falling action and resolution, which are the fourth and fifth parts, are the inverse, okay? So a falling action is everything that happens after the climax, or the wind down following a climax. Typically, this just shows the results of the character's actions or decisions. And then the final stage is called a lot of things. Your text calls it the conclusion. Most texts call it the resolution. There's also a French word that we use for it, which is dénouement, which means the untying of knots. That's when and they all lived happily ever after, or not, but, where we sort of end at a closing part of the story. Now, as far as the 5 parts of plot are concerned, we read short stories, so it's important to know that shorter forms typically carry less pronounced elements of this plot. So there might be less exposition or less of a denouement. It might kind of end right after the climax, not a whole lot of falling action. But generally speaking, all of these are things that occur in some form or fashion in most narrative stories. But as you read, you'll want to think about what parts of the story align with those stages of plot and why the author might have made those choices.